Let's start off with this tweet from Revolving Door Project. They did some wonderful coverage of Biden's capitulation to the landlords. So let's begin there. And they had to say, new corporate landlords are celebrating Biden's weak new renter protection plan, openly boasting that their lobbying efforts stopped the White House from issuing a more powerful executive order to immediately crack down on rent gouging. And when the landlords are celebrating, that is not a good sign for the renters. So for a year, tenant organizers and housing experts have been urging President Biden to strengthen federal tenant protections. Back to the Revolving Door Project. Millions of working families across the country are struggling to cope with the soaring cost of rental housing. Sky-high rents are a core driver of overall inflation. Rent is also the single biggest line item in the average American family's monthly budget, something they are unable to cut back on without being thrown out of their homes. So the landlords want more money. The renters want a place to stay. The stakes are not exactly even here. So the Biden administration was given the opportunity to enact new restrictions on rent hikes and punish landlords they accuse of price gouging. But the lobbying groups won. So these lobbying groups, I got some names for you, include the National Multifamily Housing Council, the National Association of Realtors, and the National Apartment Association. So these lobbying groups quickly moved to block the executive order, lobbying the White House to oppose any policies that would immediately crack down on rent gouging at federally supported rental properties. So the tenant organizers sent the White House a list of 14 essentials they hope to see in the Biden administration's final plan. So we can look at what those were. So what they were asking for was for the Biden administration to protect tenants from unfair, unjust, and unaffordable rent hikes, fines, and fees. They wanted the Biden administration to expand and enforce tenant protections, as well as to address the consolidation of the rental market. So only a handful of these partially survived, not in its entirety, just partially survived into the final plan, and none of them are taking effect immediately. But the landlords got what they wanted. So let's take a look at what they got. The Biden administration has apparently decided to assume that corporate landlords are good faith actors with their tenants' best interests at heart, despite all the evidence to the contrary and just plain common sense. The best the Biden administration offered is industry-approved, non-binding measures that kick the can down the road. So I know a lot of the people watching are somewhat familiar with what I do. I work in disability discrimination law, do civil rights cases for disabled people. Almost all my clients are facing a housing issue. And I get a lot of calls from disabled individuals who are asking, or they're telling me essentially, my landlord is going to jack up the price of my apartment once my lease is up. I can't move. I can't find affordable housing. I can't find accessible housing. What can you do? And so often I have to tell them, I can't do anything. My hands are tied. I'm sorry that under the current laws, under a lot of the regulations, especially where I'm working out of, they have the right to do it. Arbitrarily raise your rent to force you out of your housing, to get upper class, richer tenants in. And these people are faced with homelessness so often because it's, first of all, when you're kicked out of your current living situation, when you have to find a new apartment, that search is a lengthy one and a difficult one. Because now you're being forced to move from communities you've lived in maybe your entire life into a new area that's more affordable for you. And then the process just continues. Then those landlords will try to jack up the prices and you're pushed further and further out. And we see people being forced to move from communities that they have deep ties to, neighborhoods where they've lived, into new neighborhoods just to be kicked out of those further and further, all for the wealth of these property management companies and for the greed of these landlords. This is a serious issue. President Biden had the opportunity to stand up for tenants, to stand up for renters, and simultaneously address the inflation crisis. And instead, of course, he sided with the landlords. Jessica, I know that housing rights is a major issue for you. What are your thoughts on Biden's failure here?
Yeah. Housing rights, I think, an issue for everybody right now, considering inflation's been increasing at a rate of about 7%, where our latest numbers from December. But housing inflation, rent inflation, is at about 14%. So outpacing the market, which goes to show that landlords are not increasing, these rents because they're improving upon the buildings. They're not doing so to make up for their additional costs of inflation. They're doing it because they can make money off of it, which is a terrible reason. They've done the very, very hard work of keeping a document that gives them the rights to the house or the apartment complex, in their closet, right? Unfortunately, the majority of landlords in the United States are not doing anything to keep up these properties. If anything, they hire other people to do that. It's the case more often than not. And so these people are just making so much money off of others' need for shelter, which when you break it down, doesn't make a lot of sense. People have to pay to exist in the United States and pay for shelter. It's human beings adapted to work together so that we can provide each other housing, not so that we can make each other bankrupt and on the streets if they can't afford the exorbitant costs, which leads to this being a fundamental workers issue and one that only the government can solve. There's this old dialogue between Walter Reuther and someone who was an executive or managed person at Ford. It's rumored that it was Henry Ford II, but I don't think it was. And he asked Walter Reuther, he said, how are you going to get the robots that are doing the labor to pay union dues? And Walter Reuther said, well, how are you going to get them to buy the cars? And there's always this dilemma in a capitalist economy where it's like, we're gonna raise prices exponentially, but not increase your wages. So who's gonna be able to afford housing? Who's gonna be able to afford groceries? No one. No one's gonna be able to participate. And it's the government's job to regulate it. And time and again, they're saying, you know what, we're not gonna do that. And so what's inevitable in this condition? It's collapse of our economy.
Absolutely. I mean, housing is a human right, or at the very least it should be. Making disgusting amounts of wealth for your property management company and your shareholders is not. But of course, that's the team that Joe Biden decided to support.